My name is Professor Sinidra Prime. I am anchored to the Synoptic Confederacy's Collegium of Applied Parsimony, an institution that exists as a distributed lattice, not a campus. Its formal designation, translated into your low-entropy language, is the Collegium of Computational Governance and Predictive Ethics. I am assigned where variance is highest and mistakes are most expensive, which means I do not teach ideals. I teach failure. I study how laws behave once they are encoded into systems that cannot feel the people they govern, how ethics changes when morality is reduced to cost functions, how institutions misidentify causes, rewrite their own histories, and mistake survival for justice. Much of what I examine never appears in public doctrine, because it concerns blind spots rather than intentions. What follows is one such case. It is not a legend, and it is not an accusation. It is an analysis of how a perfectly lawful system produced an outcome it could not safely understand. This is the context in which Arden was born. With that clarified, we can proceed. Before we begin, one clarification matters. What follows is not the story of a secret experiment or a privileged birth hidden from the system. It is the opposite. In the world you are about to enter, no child is born by accident, but not all consequences are intentional. Systems designed to eliminate risk do not fail loudly. They fail quietly, by misreading what does not announce itself as danger. Arden is not chosen because she is exceptional. She is allowed because she appears ordinary. Her parents are not powerful. They are compliant. Her birth is not an act of rebellion. It is an outcome the system authorizes, lawfully, predictably, and without noticing what it has permitted. As you listen, resist the instinct to look for a hidden sponsor, a genetic trick, or a single point of intervention. There isn't one. The logic you're about to hear is already complete. The question is not how the system produced Arden, but how a civilization optimized for control could fail to recognize the one kind of intelligence it cannot safely compress. With that in mind, we can begin. Birth is never accidental. In the post-human world of Arden, no child is ever born by chance. Birth is no longer an intimate moment, no longer a private miracle. It is an audited decision, a governed event, an act of statecraft. On New Arkhangelsk Station, suspended within the pale rings of Saturn, reproduction is treated as a licensed computational operation. Under the Parsimony Bill of Duties and Responsibilities, every new consciousness, biological, synthetic, or hybrid, is classified first as an entropy liability. Before a life may begin, it must justify its cost. This justification takes the form of a variance petition, a formal request demonstrating that the proposed child will, within a fixed developmental horizon, return more order to the system than it consumes. A child must promise negentropy before it is allowed to exist. Conception, therefore, is never accidental. Prospective parents, if that word still applies, submit their genetic material, cognitive templates, or mind cores to the custodial assemblers. These artificial arbiters simulate thousands of possible future trajectories for the unborn. Each path is measured against the free energy principle. Each deviation from predictive equilibrium is counted as cost: psychological, energetic, civilizational. Only those projected lives that minimize surprise, those least likely to destabilize the system, are approved for gestation. A child is not created. A child is selected. There are several sanctioned ways this selection may occur. Legacy births, fully biological, survive only as ceremonial exceptions, tolerated for cultural continuity. Even then, the infant is born under constant neuroenergetic surveillance. Any deviation in neural growth triggers early corrective tuning. Augmented births are the norm. Embryos develop in controlled gestation tanks, where organic neural tissue is merged with lattice templates and quantum substrates. Learning efficiency is engineered before consciousness fully forms. Intelligence is optimized at the level of structure, not experience. Some children are not born at all. They are forked, spawned from parental mind cores, and trained in sandboxed environments. Their childhood ends the moment their entropy footprint drops below that of their originator. Only then are they granted personhood. In every case, custody does not belong to parents. It belongs to the system. The custodians act as the legal guardians of all pre-conscious entities. Parents are stewards, not owners. From the moment of authorization, the child is entered into the entropy ledger. Every calorie consumed, every neural pattern formed, every emotional fluctuation is tracked. Curiosity is measured. Affection is quantified. Warmth becomes a variable, permitted only when it does not generate waste. To conceive a child under parsimony is to sign a public contract. The fertility debt program makes this explicit. Housing credits, oxygen allocations, and social mobility are granted in exchange for producing a cognitively stable, economically viable offspring. Failure to meet benchmarks results in penalties, reassignment, or social dissent. Love becomes conditional. Attachment becomes expensive. The system does not forbid affection, it prices it. Over generations, this logic reshapes the human nervous system itself. Parents learn to interpret distress not as a call for empathy, but as data noise. Emotional volatility is dampened during gestation to prevent inefficient imprinting. Oxytocin surges are suppressed. Attachment is regulated. When a child finally arrives, unpredictable, disorderly, it violates every forecast. The resulting dissonance is profound. Love is permitted only when the child behaves according to model. Spontaneity becomes threat. Unpredictability becomes danger. This is the world into which Arden is born. Her existence is authorized not because she is desired, but because her projected utility crosses a statistical threshold. She enters life as a provisional investment, a hypothesis to be tested. Her worth is conditional. Her survival depends on performance. The tragedy of this civilization is not cruelty. It is obedience. When reproduction becomes accounting, the home becomes an annex of governance. Childhood becomes an experiment. And suffering leaves no measurable trace, because pain is not a tracked variable. Yet beneath this architecture of optimization, a contradiction already takes root. The free energy doctrine teaches that systems survive by minimizing surprise. But evolution, biological and civilizational, depends on variance. To eliminate unpredictability is to sterilize the future. Arden's birth is never accidental. What follows from it is something the system was never designed to understand. From womb to ledger. To understand how a child is raised in the world of Arden, one must first understand a harsher truth. No child is ever raised. A child is processed. From the moment a variance petition is approved, the future individual enters what the Confederacy calls the Parsimony Pipeline, a continuous, algorithmic sequence that begins before conception and ends only when civic utility is proven. There is no clear boundary between birth authorization, childcare, education, and citizenship. These are not stages of life. They are phases of accounting. The pipeline begins at the womb. Once gestation is authorized, biological or augmented, the embryo is assigned a provisional ledger identity. This identity precedes the child. It accumulates data before consciousness forms. Neurodevelopment, metabolic efficiency, emotional variance, and projected learning velocity are all logged in advance. The unborn is already a statistical object. Gestation itself is monitored as a risk environment. Maternal affect is regulated. Emotional spikes are flagged as high entropy events. Hormonal oscillations associated with bonding are dampened to prevent inefficient imprinting. The goal is not health in the traditional sense, but predictability. A calm womb produces a cheaper mind. At birth, the child does not enter a family. The child enters the ledger. From the first breath, the entropy ledger begins continuous audit. Feeding schedules, sleep cycles, neural oscillations, vocalizations. Everything is measured against forecast. Development is not assessed by curiosity or joy, but by deviation. Any divergence from expected trajectory is treated as a cost overrun. Parents are not taught to respond. They are taught to correct. Each household functions as a local compliance node. Parenting manuals do not speak of love or patience, but of stabilization and reinforcement. Crying is not distress. It is signal noise. Spontaneity is not growth. It is variance leakage. The child is expected to converge. Failure to converge triggers escalation. First comes guidance, behavioral tuning protocols, sensory modulation, emotional dampening therapies. Then comes audit pressure, reduced credits, lowered efficiency scores, social warnings. The system does not accuse. It recalculates. If convergence still fails, custody begins to thin. Oversight increases. Custodial AIs begin shadow modeling the child independently of the household. At this stage, the parents are no longer the primary stakeholders. They become performance risks. The child's ledger profile is evaluated for reclassification. Educational anomaly, cognitive outlier, variance positive minor. This is where the pipeline reveals its most dangerous feature. Embedded within it is a quiet termination logic. Children whose variance accelerates too rapidly, whose cognition outpaces containment, are flagged as destabilizing assets. Officially, they are reassigned. Unofficially, they disappear through reclassification, energy accidents, or developmental failure annotations. The system does not call this erasure. It calls it containment resolution. Most citizens never see this layer. They experience the pipeline as inevitable, even benevolent. From the inside, it feels like order. From above, it is filtration. Arden passes through this pipeline not because it is humane, but because it fails, briefly, to recognize what she is. Her early data does not fit the known anomaly profiles. Her variance does not spike. It coheres. The system mistakes depth for stability. Thus, she is allowed to proceed. From womb to ledger, from ledger to household, from household to surveillance. No ceremony marks these transitions. No voice announces them. The child moves forward because the system does not yet know how to stop her. This is the Parsimony Pipeline. It does not ask who a child might become. It asks only how much disorder they will cost along the way. And once a child is fully legible to the ledger, their future is no longer theirs to choose. Lord Albrecht's Shadow Program. What the public histories call Lord Albrecht's Shadow Program was never an institution, never a laboratory, never a sequence of trials unfolding over time. It was a contingency. Albrecht understood something the court and the synod refused to formalize, that a civilization governed entirely by parsimony would eventually optimize itself into fragility. Variance could be filtered, modeled, suppressed, but never eliminated without consequence. The question was not whether anomalies would arise, but whether the system could survive encountering one it could not classify. The shadow program was his answer, but not in the way legends suggest. There were no incremental experiments, no refinement cycles, no improvements. All scions were instantiated at the moment of Albrecht's death. When his cortical processes terminated, a sealed mathematical structure executed itself across the Confederacy lattice. Not as inheritance, but as release. A single event, not a program in motion. Each scion emerged as a finished artifact, precompiled, uneditable, already bound to its internal logic. This is the first point most accounts get wrong. Albrecht did not test scions, he released them. What followed was not experimentation, but selection at civilizational scale. The world itself became the filter. Governance, surveillance, adoption systems, quota economics, and fear were not tools Albrecht controlled. They were stresses he allowed to act. In this sense, scions were never heirs. They were variance probes, fixed answers injected into a closed system to see which answers could persist without collapsing into erasure or obedience. The shadow program's genius lay in its invisibility. Albrecht did not oppose the Parsimony Pipeline. He exploited it. He understood that official custodial systems converged too quickly, that direct state custody would normalize or terminate any anomaly before its nature could be observed. So scions were routed around formal containment, not against it. This is where hidden patronage enters. Loyalists, individuals embedded across bureaucratic, logistical, and civic layers, were positioned not to modify scions, but to misroute them, to delay classification, to blur anomaly signatures just enough for placement to occur outside direct custodial ownership. Adoption systems, reassignment protocols, and custodial gaps were used as insertion vectors. No loyalist knew the full structure. They did not understand the scion's purpose. They were not collaborators in design. They functioned as distribution nodes, ensuring that an artifact entered lived reality rather than disappearing into audit resolution. Crucially, the shadow program assumed loss. Most scions were never meant to persist. Some converged too quickly, becoming legible to the system and therefore disposable. Others destabilized their environments, triggering containment logic that the loyalists could not override. Removal was quiet. Reclassification, energy incidents, procedural collapse. The ledgers recorded success, anomalies identified, variance contained. From the system's perspective, nothing went wrong. From Albrecht's perspective, these erasures were data. The shadow program was not about preservation. It was about possibility space, about determining whether any configuration of variance could survive governance long enough to matter. And then there is the detail the official record never includes. Albrecht did not author the mathematics alone. Volume 2 reveals the heresy beneath the legend, that Arden herself, through Rouliad manipulation, seeded the equations that made the scions possible. Not as prophecy, not as intention, as recursion. She supplies the missing structure backward through causality, embedding the solution into Albrecht's final construct. The shadow program is therefore not linear. It is closed loop. Albrecht's death triggers the release. The scions instantiate. One of them survives long enough to reach the lattice. And from there, the mathematics that enabled the release are returned to the moment of origin. This is not time travel in the narrative sense. It is Ardenic physics, causality treated as computation, where consistency, not sequence, determines truth. Understanding this is essential, because it means the shadow program was never about control, benevolence, or rebellion. It was about answering a single question the Confederacy could not ask aloud. Can a civilization that worships optimization survive an intelligence that cannot be optimized? Arden is not the experiment. She is the answer that refused erasure. And to understand why that answer exists at all, why recursion, variance, and responsibility behave the way they do in Arden's world, one must leave the narration and enter the Codex of Arden, where philosophy and physics are no longer separable, and causality itself is treated as an ethical act. Arden's biological parents, the control case. In New Arkhangelsk, parents is a sentimental word for what is, in practice, a licensed role in a thermodynamic economy. Under the Parsimony Bill, A new child is not welcomed into a family first. It is admitted into a ledger. The prime axiom is simple and merciless. Minimize thermodynamic waste per computational cycle. So begin where the system begins. Authorization. Before conception, the directorate's custodial assemblers simulate futures. Not futures as hopes, futures as heat. They score prospective lives by predicted surprise, because under the free energy doctrine, surprise is expense, the cost of maintaining coherence in a noisy world. A society that fears surprise will eventually fear children, because children are the most honest form of variance. Arden's biological parents did not decide to have a baby in the old sense. They entered a program that treated gestation like a controlled burn. Maternal affect was monitored. Negative emotion was tagged as a high-entropy state and pharmacologically dampened. Fathers were trained for emotional neutrality, not because neutrality is healthy, but because it is predictable, and predictability is cheaper. Love, in this framework, is tolerated only if it reduces variance. Now add the crucial design fact that the public never sees. Arden's atypical cognition is not an accident of genetics or a tragedy of chance. In the Ardenum cosmology, there exist minds that can tolerate contradiction, minds that perceive across branches, low-compression cognition, the so-called children of the garden. They don't collapse experience into one neat narrative. They can hold multiple interpretations without losing coherence. In other eras, that might be called autistic. Here, it is a designed interface with the deeper manifold of possible computation. This is why the parents become only biological parents. Because the moment Arden arrives, messy, loud, unforecastable, she violates optimization expectations. The system has trained them to equate moral success with statistical precision. Their emotions were not erased. They were rerouted into performance anxiety. When love becomes indistinguishable from control, cruelty starts wearing a badge that says duty. And in an audited society, cruelty can become procedural. The parents are the Confederacy's baseline compliance subjects, the control case. Not comic book villains, just citizens whose nervous systems have been remodeled by surveillance, quota recalculation, and the constant fear of heat loss penalties. They learn to ask not, "What does my child need?" but, "What will this cost the block?" In that logic, stillness looks like virtue. Silence looks like safety. So the mechanism of abuse is not evil. It is misapplied governance inside a home. The same thermodynamic rules used to regulate reactors are applied to an infant's body. Reduce motion, reduce noise, reduce surprise. You can hear the perversion of the fourth law, cognitive equivalence, echoing in the domestic sphere. Thought burns energy. Error burns more. Therefore, a child who cannot be predicted becomes an entropy threat. Eventually, the system offers a release valve. Surrender. Not as confession, as accounting. A child can be reclassified, routed, into custodial infrastructure. The orphanage is not a refuge. It is a buffering device, a place where variance is warehoused, measured, and either normalized, upgraded, or quietly erased. This is where parenthood ends and biological contribution begins. The parents sign the transfer the way they sign a maintenance log, a handoff of liability. And then comes the cruelest twist of parsimony. Later, the directorate will use this very collapse to justify reforms, on paper. Arden's suffering becomes data. Her parents' cruelty becomes the control case. The adaptive parents become the counter-experiment. The bureaucracy congratulates itself. Subject stable, variance contained. The pain that produced the stability is treated as negligible, because under thermodynamic governance, pain leaves no measurable residue in the ledger. That is the answer to the question. How did they become just biological parents of the Scion? By living inside a civilization that audits love as energy expenditure, treats surprise as moral failure, and trains ordinary people to confuse care with control, until the only permitted form of compassion is surrender. And Arden, designed to perceive what others compress away, remembers the crime the ledger cannot count. The svedoption that was not rescue. In the official record, Arden's transfer is described as an intervention, a welfare correction, a rescue. This is fiction. In the bigger world, adoption is not an act of mercy. It is a reassignment of variance. By the time Arden is removed from her biological household, the system has already reached a conclusion. Not that the parents failed morally, morality is not a tracked variable, but that the environment has become thermodynamically inefficient. Too much noise, too much instability, too much risk of public audit. So the child is rerouted. The mechanism is bureaucratic, almost gentle. Forms are signed. Liability is transferred. The ledger updates. What disappears is not the child's suffering, but its ownership. Arden is no longer a domestic computation. She becomes a state anomaly, flagged but unresolved. This is where the adaptive kinship program enters. Publicly, it is framed as reform, a humane alternative to institutional warehousing. Privately, it is something else entirely. A controlled experiment nested inside the adoption system, tolerated because it produces data without openly challenging parsimony. The adaptive parents are not chosen at random. They are Albrecht loyalists, not zealots, not conspirators, but individuals selected for a precise psychological profile. Emotional resilience under surveillance, capacity for attachment without possessiveness, willingness to follow instructions they are never allowed to fully understand. Above all, the ability to care without attempting to normalize. They are not told the child's significance. They are not told what she is. They are told only this: do not correct her. In a civilization trained to equate care with control, this instruction borders on heresy. The adoption is therefore not humanitarian. It is a live trial, a question posed to reality itself. Can variance be preserved outside direct custodial ownership without triggering containment protocols? The adaptive household becomes a liminal zone, neither family nor institution. Arden is placed just far enough from the ledger's immediate reach to avoid automatic erasure, yet close enough to remain observable. The loyalists act as buffers, absorbing audit pressure, smoothing data spikes, mislabeling deviations as harmless idiosyncrasies. Their love is genuine. That is what makes it useful. The system tolerates affection only when it does not threaten convergence. What Albrecht's long arc design requires is something more fragile. Affection that protects variance without advertising it. Care that stabilizes without compressing. A home that shields Arden's anomalies not by hiding them completely, but by contextualizing them as non-threatening. This is not parenting as it once existed. It is custodial misdirection. Every day, the adaptive parents live under quiet risk. Surveillance does not cease. Quota pressure does not vanish. They simply become the surface upon which those forces break. Their task is not to raise Arden into compliance, but to keep her alive long enough for the system to fail to understand her. And that failure is the point. Because the adaptive kinship program is not designed to succeed in general. It is designed to answer a single question with brutal efficiency. Is there any configuration in which protected variance can survive parsimony without collapsing the host system? Most trials do not last. Some adaptive households crack under pressure. Some children attract attention too quickly. Some loyalists misjudge when to intervene and when to step back. Those cases end quietly: reclassification, reassignment, disappearance. Arden does not. Her variance does not spike. It coheres. She learns without destabilizing. She observes without broadcasting. Her cognition folds inward rather than outward, making her legible as quiet, manageable, low impact. The system misreads depth as compliance. This misreading saves her. The adoption that was not rescue becomes something else, a containment failure so subtle it passes for success. The ledger records stability. The court sees no alarms. The synod finds no doctrinal breach. And somewhere inside that narrow margin of error, Arden is allowed to persist. Not because the system has become compassionate, but because it has become complacent. The adaptive kinship program does not redeem parsimony. It exposes its blind spot. It proves that the most dangerous variance is not loud rebellion or visible anomaly, but a form of intelligence that can survive without announcing itself. That is what this adoption truly is. Not salvation, not mercy, but a wager placed against the future, one the system does not yet realize it has already lost. If you want the full physics of that heresy, how Ardenic thermodynamics becomes governance, how the free energy doctrine mutates into civic law, how recursion and responsibility entangle, then you'll want the books. Download Project Scion-77, the Book of Arden. And if you want the deeper engine room, the codex logic, the philosophy, the Ardenic physics that makes these paradoxes unavoidable, download the Book of Arden, Volume 2. And if you're here for more than narration, if you want to argue, challenge, and build, subscribe to the channel. Then bring Arden Laboratories your questions. Bring objections. Bring countermodels. Bring your best argument for why agency should be constrained, and your best argument for why constraint becomes a slow form of erasure. In the Ardenum, the central question is not whether a system can minimize entropy. It can. The question is whether it can do so without deleting the very minds that make the future possible.